Connecting to cloud server. I can't really tell if it's.
I see the little
going.
red light.
Command Shift R for recording.
I think Command Shift C does it and then saves it to the cloud.
Oh, we're in business. Okay, you're sure we're recording? Did I mute everyone? Oh, everyone's muted.
It says you're recording.
Cool. Okay. All right, I'll edit this out later. Okay, I'm gonna get this started then.
Blooper reel. You got to leave it.
Okay. What time is it? It's 4:04. Okay, here we go. Hello, everyone. It's not loading.
Hello.
Hello. Here we go. Okay. All right. So I'm Izzy Fitzpatrick. I teach math at the Loomis Chaffee School, and I'm going to be talking to you about my inquiry project today. So my inquiry question was, how can I best relate statistics to my students' interests and passions? And I approached this largely through project-based learning. So my motivation for this question came largely from three places. For one, my own high school experience. I have a photo here of me at a math and engineering camp, and I was always more interested in math when I saw the direct applications. Also, my motivation came from majoring in statistics, and that being one of the first spaces I saw how applicable math could be, and also for my first year of teaching, where I didn't feel like I was bringing in real world context enough, and I wanted to do more of that. So my literature largely focused on different ways to approach project-based learning in the classroom, and there were four themes that came up. So one was this idea of these real-world applications. There was also the idea of bringing in as much intrinsic motivation as possible, so helping the students be personally invested and not just focused on their grades. There was also this idea of students taking ownership of their learning, and there was also a big focus on how collaboration can enhance project work. So there were three general models of project work that I was looking at, and project exercise and project orientation are two ends of the spectrum, but what I chose was project component, which falls somewhere in the middle, so it's not fully project-based and it's not these little projects, but it's these medium-sized projects that are taught alongside the more traditional content. So my way of going about this included four things. So for one, I had lecture slides, and that's where I would teach the content in a more traditional way, and this was content that students would apply later in their projects. There were also video clips and readings, so this was my way of helping students see how statistics could be applied to a range of interests and bring that into a larger context. I also had these kind of mini projects that were just in-class activities that were more structured to help students become better at project work. And then the biggest thing that I focused on were these projects. So there were a range of in-class activities, but to give you an idea, one which you can see a photo of on the left was this basketball lab. So we just spent a class learning about hypothesis testing and shooting free throws. We also had something called the coffee challenge, where students used statistical analysis to come up with a business model for coffee dispensers. So the projects themselves, which was what I focused on the most, included 4 projects over the course of the fall term. There was 1 project per chapter of content, and because it was project component, they were also getting tested and quizzed on that same content. Each of these projects was added to a digital portfolio, which took the form of a website, and all of their projects culminated in some form of final product, but this always included a write-up and a presentation. So I wanted to quickly share what a digital portfolio would look like. So, and see here, all of the work would be included in one space. So there were different tabs for every single project. Here's one of the projects. with all the work organized in one space. And they would also include a multimedia reflection that could be a podcast or a video at the end where they went through and reflected on their work over the course of the term. So all of these concluded with some form of presentation, and it was really important that students get in the habit of communicating their ideas with the appropriate statistical language and gain confidence presenting. These were both individual presentations and group presentations, depending on the project. So the way I went about collecting this data started with surveys. So there were constant surveys at the beginning of projects, in the middle, and the end. I also used focus groups. So this was a way to delve deeper into questions from my surveys that I wanted to know more about. So there were a group of students that I would meet with and interview. I also kept a teacher journal where I would gather my observations from the class and keep track of what was going on. And I also had class artifacts. So those were the projects themselves and the digital portfolios themselves, which I looked to see if I was actually helping my students apply their interests in different ways. So the goals of this data and collection, for one, was to measure my students' ability to apply content to a real world context. I was also looking to see if students seemed like they were intrinsically motivated and they weren't just doing this for a grade, but seemed like they were actually invested in it. I was also looking for patterns of students taking ownership of their learning and student autonomy. And I was also looking at the effects of collaboration on group work and seeing how collaborating affected their group work. So for the surveys, there were a few different themes that emerged, but a big idea that came up was that students felt very satisfied with this idea that they could take the content they were learning in class and apply it in a way that was personally interesting to them. And that applied both for survey data of the school and for data that was global data or data that they looked up. The focus group sessions, there were a few different themes that emerged. One that was particularly interesting to me was that students were really enthusiastic about collaboration, and they felt like they were more creative when they could bounce ideas off of each other. And students also expressed again and again this strong preference for projects over tests, but there was also this idea that students felt more motivated when studying for a test when they knew that they would later be applying that same content to a project. So one student from a focus group session was talking here about how it was just so much easier for him to become invested in the content when he was working on a project that he had chosen rather than for a test. And this was an idea that was expressed again and again by many of my students. So my teacher journal entries kind of provided this bigger picture view of what was going on, and it was also just the day-to-day. One idea that was really important that I kept writing about that I didn't foresee would be so important was this idea of creativity. So it's something that students don't necessarily associate with the math classroom, but it becomes so important in project-based learning. So I was constantly thinking, like, how do I help my students become more creative? How do I incorporate this in the rubric? And I also would take note of different student feedback I received and try to incorporate that into future projects. And I also think a lot about when were my students more engaged, when were they less engaged over the course of the class. So lastly, I looked at my class artifacts, the projects themselves. So I was really concerned about my students actually applying their projects to a real world context. So at a certain point, I categorized all of the projects they did into different fields. And as you can see here, they all fell into these different very applied contexts. And it was really interesting to see, for example, students who expressed in surveys that they were passionate about psych, doing these social experiments, and or students who said they were passionate about economics, doing projects related to econ. And there was definitely an association there. And I also looked for the recurrence of project themes. So it was important to me to see that students, for example, who expressed an interest in health, did projects twice on health. And what you see here is that there were almost no students, I think it was like one student who never repeated topics. So most students picked a theme and would try to incorporate into multiple projects. So some of my takeaways, one was that students expressed quite a bit of enthusiasm over this greater sense of choice. Another was that students felt way more intrinsically motivated when it came to learning statistics when they had these opportunities to do projects. A third that was very important to me personally was that we built this very strong classroom community, and just how powerful it was to have students constantly bringing in their passions and interest into class, and how that helped us all get to know each other so much better, and the classroom environment that fostered. And lastly, something that's really important to students is grades, and something that came up again and again was this frustration over how personal it feels to get a project grade versus a test grade. So that's something that I definitely had to take into account. So going forward, the most important things for me would be to continue this focus. As far as the project component approach, I did enjoy it, but I think it can overload the students a little bit since there's so many tests and projects, so I might modify that. And I would also work to give my students even more detailed project feedback, just because it's so personal and students really pour their hearts into it, and they need very thorough feedback so that it makes sense to them. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everyone. How do I stop recording?